Chapter 2 of Murder in the Gunroom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder in the Gunroom by H. B. Piper. Chapter 2. After ushering his client out the hall door and closing it behind her, Rand turned and said, "All right, Kathy, or Dave, whoever's out there, come on in." Then he went back to his desk and reached under it, snapping off a switch. As he straightened, the door from the reception office opened and his secretary, Kathy O'Grady, entered, loading a cigarette into an 8-inch amber holder. She was a handsome woman, built on the generous lines of a Renaissance goddess. None of the Renaissance masters, however, had ever employed a model so strikingly Hibernian. She had blue eyes and a fair, highly colored complexion. She wore green, which went well with her flaming red hair, and a good deal of gold costume jewelry. Behind her came Dave Ritter. He was Rand's assistant and also Kathy's lover. He was 5 or 6 years older than his employer and slightly built. His hair, fighting a stubborn rear-guard action against baldness, was an indeterminate mousy gray brown. It was one of his professional assets that nobody ever noticed him, not even in a crowd of one. When he wanted it to, his thin face could assume the weary, baffled expression of a middle-aged bookkeeper with a wife and 4 children on $50 a week. Actually, he drew 3 times that much, had no wife, admitted to no children. During the war, he and Kathy had kept the Tri-State Agency in something better than a state of suspended animation while Rand had been in the Army. Ritter fumbled a Camel out of his shirt pocket and made a beeline for the desk, appropriating Rand's lighter and sharing the flame with Kathy. "You know, Jeff," he said, "one of the reasons why this agency never made any money while you were away was that I never had the unadulterated insolence to ask the kind of fees you do. I was listening in on the extension in the file room. I could hear Kathy damn near faint when you said $5 grand. "Yes, $5,000 for appraising a collection they've been offered 10 for, and she only has a third interest," Kathy said, retracting herself into the chair lately vacated by Gladys Fleming. "If that makes sense, now—" "Don't you get it, Kathleen Mavourneen?" Ritter asked. "She doesn't care about the pistols. She wants Jeff to find out who fixed up that accident for Fleming. You heard that big, long, shaggy dog story about exactly what happened and where everybody was supposed to have been at the time. I hope you got all that recorded. It was all told for a purpose." Rand had picked up the outside phone and was dialing. In a moment, a girl's voice answered. "Carter Tipton's law office, good afternoon." "Hello, Reva. Is Tip available?" "Oh, hello, Jeff. Just a sec, I'll see." She buzzed another phone. "Jeff Rand on the line," she announced. A clear, slightly Harvard-accented male voice took over. "Hello, Jeff. Now, what sort of malfeasance have you committed?" "Nothing so far, cross my fingers," Rand replied. "I just want a little information. Are you busy?" "Okay, I'll be up directly." He replaced the phone and turned to his disciples. "Our client," he said, "wants 2 jobs done on 1 fee. Getting the pistol collection sold is one job. Exploring the whys and wherefores of that, quote, accident, unquote, is the other. She has a hunch, and probably nothing much better, that there's something sour about the accident. She expects me to find evidence to that effect while I'm at Rosemont, going over the collection. I'm not excluding other possibilities, but I'll work on that line until and unless I find out differently. $5,000 should cover both jobs." "You think that's how it is?" Kathy asked. "Look, Kathy, I got just as far in arithmetic at school as you did, and I suspect that Mrs. Fleming got at least as far as long division herself. For reasons I stated, I simply couldn't have handled that collection business for anything like a reasonable fee. So I told her $5,000, thinking that would stop her. When it didn't, I knew she had something else in mind, and when she went into all that detail about the death of her husband, she as good as told me that was what it was. Now, I'm sorry I didn't say $10,000. I think she'd have bought it at that price just as cheerfully. She thinks Lane Fleming was murdered. Well, on the face of what she told me, so do I." "All right, Professor, expound," Ritter said. "You heard what he was supposed to have shot himself with," Rand began. "A Colt-type percussion revolver. You know what they're like, and I know enough about Lane Fleming to know how much experience he had with old arms. I can't believe that he'd buy a pistol without carefully examining it, and I can't believe that he'd bring that thing home and start working on it without seeing the caps on the nipples and the charges in the chambers if it had been loaded. And if it had been, he would have first taken off the caps, and then taken it apart and drawn the charges. And she says he started working on it as soon as he got home, presumably around 5, and then took time out for dinner, and then went back to work on it. And more than half an hour later, there was a shot, and he was killed." Rand blew a Bronx cheer. "If that accident had been the McCoy, it would have happened in the first 5 minutes after he started working on that pistol. No, in the first 30 seconds. And then, when they found him, he had the revolver in his right hand and an oily rag in his left. I hope both of you noticed that little touch." "Yeah, when I clean a gat, I generally have it in my left hand and clean with my right," Ritter said. "Exactly. And why do you use an oily rag?" Rand inquired. Ritter looked at him blankly for half a second, then grinned ruefully. "Damn, I never thought of that," he admitted. "Okay, he was bumped off, all right." "But you use oily rags on guns," Kathy objected. "I've seen both of you often enough." "When we're all through, honey," Ritter told her. "Yes. When he brought home that revolver, it was in neglected condition," Rand said. "Either surface rusted or filthy with gummed oil and dirt. Even if Mrs. Fleming hadn't mentioned that point, the length of time he spent cleaning it would justify such an inference. He would have taken it apart down to the smallest screw and cleaned everything carefully and then put it together again. And then, when he had finished, he would have gone over the surface with an oiled rag before hanging it on the wall. He would certainly not have surface oiled it before removing the charges, if there ever were any. I assume the revolver he was found holding, presumably the one which he was killed, was another one. And I would further assume that the killer wasn't particularly familiar with the subject of firearms, antique, care and maintenance of. And with all the hollering and whooping and hysterics throwing, nobody noticed the switch," Ritter finished. "Wonder what happened to the one he was really cleaning." "That I may possibly find out," Rand said. "The general incompetence with which this murder was committed gives me plenty of room to hope that it may still be lying around somewhere." "Well, have you thought that it might just be suicide?" Kathy asked. "I have, very briefly. I dismissed the thought almost at once," Rand told her, "for 2 reasons. One, that if it had been suicide, Mrs. Fleming wouldn't want it poked into. She'd be more than willing to let it ride as an accident. And 2, I doubt if a man who prided himself on his gun knowledge, as Fleming did, would want his self-shooting to be taken for an accident. I'm damn sure I wouldn't want my friends to go around saying, 'What a dope, didn't know it was loaded.' I doubt if he'd even expect people to believe that it had been an accident." He shook his head. "No, the only inference I can draw is that somebody murdered Fleming and then faked evidence intended to indicate an accident." He rose. "I'll be back in a little. Think it over while I'm gone." Carter Tipton had his law office on the floor above the Tri-State Detective Agency. He handled all Rand's not infrequent legal involvements, and Rand did all his investigating and witness chasing. Annually, they compared books to see who owed whom how much. Tipton was about 5 years Rand's junior, and had been in the Navy during the war. He was frequently described as New Belfast's leading younger attorney and most eligible bachelor. His dark, conservatively cut clothes fitted him as though they had been sprayed on. He wore gold-rimmed glasses, and he was so freshly barbered, manicured, valeted, and scrubbed as to give the impression that he had been born in cellophane and just unwrapped. He leaned back in his chair and waved his visitor to a seat. "Tip, do you know anything about this Fleming family out at Rosemont?" Rand began, getting out his pipe and tobacco. "The premixed foods Flemings?" Tipton asked. "Yes, a little. Which one of them wants you to frame what on which other one?" "That'll do for a good simplified description to start with," Rand commented. "Why, my client is Mrs. Gladys Fleming. As to what she wants..." He told the young lawyer about his recent interview and subsequent conclusions. "So you see," he finished, "she won't commit herself, even with me. Maybe she thinks I have more official status and more obligations to the police than I have. Maybe she isn't sure in her own mind and wants me to see independently if there's any smell of something dead in the woodpile. Or she may think that having a private detective called in may throw a scare into somebody. Or maybe she thinks somebody may be fixing up an accident for her next, and she wants a pistol-toting gent in the house for a while, or any combination thereof. Personally, I deplore these clients who hire you to do one thing and expect you to do another, but with $5,000 for sweetening, I can take them. Yes, you know I've heard rumors of suicide, but this is the first whiff of murder I've caught." He hesitated slightly. "I must say I'm not greatly surprised. Lane Fleming's death was very convenient to a number of people. You know about this premix company, don't you?" "Vaguely. They manufacture ready-mixed pancake flour and ready-mixed ice cream and pudding powders. And this dehydrated vegetable soup. Pour on hot water, stir and serve, don't they? My colored boy, Buck, got some of the soup once for an experiment. We unanimously voted not to try it again. They put out quite a line of such godsends to the neophyte in the kitchen, the popularity of which is reflected in a steadily rising divorce rate," Tipton said. "They advertised very extensively, including half an hour of tear-jerking drama on a national hookup during soap opera time. Your client, the former Gladys Rand, was on the air for Premix for a couple of years. That's how Lane Fleming first met her." "So you think some irate and dyspeptic husband went to the source of his woes?" Rand inquired. "Well, not exactly. You see, Premix is only little business, as the food industry goes, but they have something very sweet. So sweet, in fact, that one of the really big fellows, National Milling and Packaging, has been going to rather extreme lengths to effect a merger. Millpack, par 100, is quoted at around 145, and Premix, par 50, is at 75 now, and Millpack is offering a 2-for-1 share exchange, which would be a little less than 4-for-1 in value. I might add, for what it's worth, that this Stephen Gresham you mentioned is Millpack's attorney, negotiator, and general Mr. Fix-It. He has been trying to put over this merger for Millpack." "I'll bear that in mind, too," Rand said. "Naturally, all this is not being shouted from the housetops," Tipton continued. "Fact is, it's a minor infraction of ethics for me to mention it to you." "I'll file it in the burn box," Rand promised. "What was the matter? Didn't Premix want to merge?" "Lane Fleming didn't, and since he held 52% of the common stock himself, try and do anything about it." "Anything short of retiring Fleming to the graveyard, that is," Rand amended. "That would do for a murder motive very nicely." "What were Fleming's objections to the merger?" "Mainly sentimental. Premix was his baby, or at least his kid brother. His father started mixing pancake flour back before the First World War, and Lane Fleming peddled it off a spring wagon. They worked up a nice little local trade, and finally a statewide wholesale business. They incorporated in the early 20s, and then, after the old man died, Lane Fleming hired an advertising agency to promote his products and built up a national distribution and took on some sidelines. Then, during the late Mr. Chamberlain's Peace in Our Time, he picked up a refuge Czech chemist and foods expert named Anton Varcek, who whipped up a lot of new products. So business got better and better, and they made more money to spend on advertising, to get more money to buy more advertising, to make more money. Like Bill Nye's Puritans digging clams in the winter to get strength to hoe corn in the summer, to get strength to dig clams in the winter. So Premix became a sort of symbol of achievement to Fleming. Then he was one of these old-model paternalistic employers, and he was afraid that if he relinquished control, a lot of his old retainers would be turned out to grass. And finally, he was opposed in principle to concentration of business ownership. He claimed it made business more vulnerable to government control and eventual socialization. I'm not sure he didn't have something there, Rand considered. We get all our corporate eggs in a few baskets, and they're that much easier for the planned economy boys to grab. Just who on the Premix side was in favor of this merger? Just about everybody but Fleming, Tipton replied. His two sons-in-laws, Fred Dunmore and Varcek, who are first and second vice presidents. Humphrey Goode, the company attorney, who doubles as board chairman. All the directors, all the New York banking crowd who are interested in Premix, and all the two-share tiny mites. I don't know who inherits Fleming's voting interest, but I can find out for you by this time tomorrow. Do that, Tip, and bill me for what you think finding out is worth, Rand said. It'll be a novel reversal of order for you to be billing me for an investigation. Now, how about the family? As distinct from the company? Well, there's your client, Gladys Fleming. She married Lane Fleming about 10 years ago, when she was 25 and he was 55. In spite of the age difference, I understand it was a fairly happy marriage. Then there are 2 daughters by a previous marriage, Nelda Dunmore and Geraldine Varsic, and their respective husbands. They all live together in a big house at Rosemont. In the company, Dunmore is sales and Varsic is production. They each have a corner of the mantle of Lane Fleming in one hand and a dirk in the other. Nelda and Geraldine hate each other like Greeks and Trojans. Nelda is the nymphomaniac sister, and Geraldine is the dipsomaniac. From time to time, temporary alliances get formed, mainly against Gladys. All of them resent the way she married herself into a third interest into the estate. You're going to have yourself a nice, pleasant little stay in the country." "I'm looking forward to it," Rand grimaced. "You mentioned suicide rumors. Such as, and who's been spreading them?" "Oh, they're the usual bodiless voices that float about," Tipton told him. "Emanating, I suspect, from sources interested in shaking out the less sophisticated small shareholders before the merger. The story is always approximately the same: that Lane Fleming saw his company drifting reefward, was unwilling to survive the shipwreck, and performed seppuku. The family are supposed to have faked up the accident afterwards. I dismiss the whole thing as a rather less than subtle bit of marketing manipulation chicanery. Or a smokescreen to cover the defects in camouflaging a murder as an accident," Rand added. Tipton nodded. "That could be so, too," he agreed. "Say somebody dislikes the looks of that accident and starts investigating. Then he runs into all this miasma of suicide rumors and promptly shrugs the whole thing off. Fleming killed himself, and the family made a few alterations and are passing it off as an accident. The families of suicides have been known to do that." "Yes. Regular defense in-depth system. If the accident line is penetrated, the suicide line is back of it," Rand said. "Well, in the last few years, we've seen defenses in-depth penetrated with monotonous regularity. I've jeeped through a couple myself to interrogate the surviving ex-defenders. It's all in having the guns and armor to smash through with." End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Murder in the Gunroom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder in the Gunroom by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 3. Humphrey Goode was 60ish, short and chunky, with a fringe of white hair around a bald crown. His brow was corrugated with wrinkles, and he peered suspiciously around through a pair of thick-lensed, black-ribboned glasses. His wide mouth curved downward at the corners in an expression that was probably intended to be stern, and succeeded only in being pompous. His office was dark and smelled of dusty books. "Mr. Rand," he began accusingly, "when your secretary called to make this appointment, she informed me that you had been retained by Mrs. Gladys Fleming." "That's correct." Rand slowly packed tobacco into his pipe and lit it. "Mrs. Fleming wants me to look after some interests of hers, and as your executor of her late husband's estate, I thought I ought to talk to you first of all." Goode's eyes narrowed behind the thick glasses. "Mr. Rand, if you're investigating the death of Lane Fleming, you're wasting your time and Mrs. Fleming's money," he lectured. "There is nothing whatever for you to find out that is not already public knowledge. Mr. Fleming was accidentally killed by the discharge of an old revolver he was cleaning. I don't know what foolish feminine impulse led Mrs. Fleming to employ you, but you'll do nobody any good in this matter, and you may do a great deal of harm." "Did my secretary tell you I was making an investigation?" Rand demanded incredulously. "She doesn't usually make mistakes of that sort." The wrinkles moved up Goode's brow like a battalion advancing in platoon front. He looked even more narrowly at Rand, his suspicion compounded with bewilderment. "Why should I investigate the death of Lane Fleming?" Rand continued. "As far as I know, Mrs. Fleming is satisfied that it was an accident. She never expressed any other belief to me. Do you think it was anything else?" "Why, of course not!" Goode exclaimed. "That's just what I was telling you. He took a fresh start. "There have been rumors, utterly without foundation, of course, that Mr. Fleming committed suicide. They are, I may say, nothing but malicious fabrications circulated for the purpose of undermining public confidence in Premix Foods Incorporated. I had thought that perhaps Mrs. Fleming might have heard them and decided, on her own responsibility, to bring you in to scotch them. I was afraid that such a step might, by giving these rumors fresh currency, defeat its intended purpose." "Oh, nothing of the sort," Rand told him. "I'm not in the least interested in how Mr. Fleming was killed, and the question is simply not involved in what Mrs. Fleming wants me to do." He stopped there. Goode was looking at him sideways, sucking in one corner of his mouth and pushing out the other. It was not a facial contortion that impressed Rand favorably. It was too reminiscent of a high school principal under whom he had suffered years ago in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Rand began to suspect that Goode might be just another self-righteous, opinionated, egotistical windbag. Such men could be dangerous, were usually quite unscrupulous, and were almost always unpleasant to deal with. "Then why," the lawyer demanded, "did Mrs. Fleming employ you?" "Well, as you know," Rand began, "the Fleming pistol collection, now the joint property of Mrs. Fleming and her two stepdaughters, is an extremely valuable asset. Mr. Fleming spent the better part of his life gathering it. At one time or another, he must have owned between 4,000 and 5,000 different pistols and revolvers. The 2,500 left to his heirs represent the result of a systematic policy of discriminating purchase, replacement of inferior items, and general improvement. It's one of the largest and most famous collections of its kind in the country." "Well?" Goode was completely out of his depth by now. "Surely Mrs. Fleming doesn't think—" "Mrs. Fleming thinks that an expert advice is urgently needed in disposing of that collection," Rand replied, carefully picking his words to fit what he estimated to be Goode's probable semantic reactions. "She has the utmost confidence in your ability and integrity as an attorney. However, she realized that you could hardly describe yourself as an antique arms expert. It happens that I am an expert in antique firearms, particularly pistols. I have a collection of my own. I am the author of a number of articles on the subject, and I am recognized as something of an authority. I know arms values and understand market conditions. Furthermore, not being a dealer or connected with any museum, I have no mercenary motive for undervaluing the collection. That's all there is to it. Mrs. Fleming has retained me as a firearms expert in connection with the collection." Goode was looking at Rand as though the latter had just torn off a mask, revealing another and entirely different set of features underneath. The change seemed to be a welcome one, but he was evidently having trouble adjusting to it. Rand grinned inwardly. Now he was going to have to find himself a new set of verbal labels and identifications. "Well, Mr. Rand, that alters the situation considerably," he said, with noticeably less hostility. He was still a bit resentful. People had no right to confuse him by jumping about from one category to another like that. Now understand, I'm not trying to be offensive, but it seems a little unusual for a private detective also to be an authority on antique firearms." "Mr. Fleming was an authority on antique firearms, and he was a manufacturer of foodstuffs," Rand parried, carefully staying inside Goode's Aristotelian system of categories and verbal identifications. "My own business does not occupy all my time, any more than his did, and I doubt if an interest in the history and development of deadly weapons is any more incongruous in a criminologist than in an industrialist. But if there's any doubt in your mind as to my qualifications, you can check with Colonel Taylor at the State Museum, or with the editor of American Rifleman." "I see," Goode nodded. "And, as you point out, being a sort of non-professional expert, you should be free from mercenary bias." He nodded again, taking off his glasses and polishing them on an outsized white handkerchief. "Frankly, now that I understand your purpose, Mr. Rand, I must say that I am quite glad that Mrs. Fleming took this step. I was perplexed about how to deal with that collection. I realized that it was worth a great deal of money, but I haven't the vaguest idea how much, or how it could be sold to the best advantage. At a rough guess, Mr. Rand, how much do you think it ought to bring?" Rand shook his head. "I only saw it twice. The last time was 2 years ago. Ask me that after I've spent a day or so going over it, and I'll be able to give you an estimate. I will say this, though. It's probably worth a lot more than the $10,000 Arnold Rivers has offered for it." That produced an unexpected effect. Goode straightened in his chair, gobbling in surprised indignation. "Arnold Rivers?" Has he had the impudence to try and buy the collection?" he demanded. "Where did you hear that?" "From Mrs. Fleming. I understand he made the offer to Fred Dunmore. That's his business, isn't it?" "I believe the colloquial term is racket," Goode said. "Why, that man is a notorious swindler, Mr. Rand. Do you know that only a week before his death, Mr. Fleming instructed me to bring suit against him, and also to secure his indictment on criminal charges of fraud?" "I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised," Rand answered. "What did he burn Fleming with?" "Here, I'll show you." Goode rose from his seat and went to a rank of steel filing cabinets behind the desk. In a moment he was back with a large manila envelope under his arm and a huge pistol in either hand. "Here, Mr. Rand," he chuckled. "We'll just test your firearms knowledge. What do you make of these?" Rand took the pistols and looked at them. They were wheel locks, apparently 16th century South German. They were a good 2 feet in overall length, with ball pommels the size of oranges and long steel belt hooks. The stocks were so covered with ivory inlay that the wood showed only in tiny interstices. The metalwork was lavishly engraved and gold inlaid. To the trigger guards were attached tags marked Fleming vs. Rivers. Rand examined each pistol separately, then compared them. Finally, he took a 6-inch rule from his pocket and made measurements, first with one edge and then with the other. "Well, I'm damned," he said, laying them on the desk. "These things are the most complete fakes I ever saw. Locks, stocks, barrels, and mountings. They're supposed to be late 16th century. I doubt if they were made before 1920. As far as I can see or measure, there isn't the slightest difference between them, except on some of the decorative inlay. The whole job must have been mic'd in 10,000ths, and what's more, whoever made them used metric measurements. You'll find pairs of English dueling pistols as early as 1775 that are almost indistinguishable, but in 1575, when these things were supposed to have been made, a gunsmith was working fine when he was working in 16th inches. They just didn't have the measuring instruments at that time to do closer work. I won't bother taking these things apart, but if I did, I'd bet all Wall Street to Junior's piggy bank that I'd find that the screws were machine-threaded and the working parts interchanged. I've heard about fakes like these." He named a famous, recently liquidated West Coast collector. "But I'd never hoped to see an example like this." Goode gave a hacking chuckle. "You'll do as an arms expert, Mr. Rand," he said, "and you'd win the piggy bank. It seems that after Mr. Fleming bought them, he took them apart and found, just as you say, that the screw threads had been machine-cut, and that the working parts were interchangeable from one pistol to the other. There were a lot of papers accompanying them. I have them here, purporting to show that they had been sold by some Austrian nobleman, an anti-Nazi refugee in whose family they had been since the reign of Maximilian II. They are, of course, fabrications. I looked up the family in the Almanach de Gotha. It simply never existed." At first, Mr. Fleming had been inclined to take the view that Rivers had been equally victimized with himself. However, when Rivers refused to take back the pistols and refund the purchase price, he altered his opinion. He placed them in my hands, instructing me to bring suit and also start criminal action. He was in a fearful rage about it, and swore that he'd drive Rivers out of business. However, before I could start the action, Mr. Fleming was killed in that accident, and as he was the sole witness to the fact of the sale, and as none of the heirs was interested, I did nothing about it. In fact, I advised them that action against Rivers would cost the estate more than they could hope to recover in damages." He picked up one of the pistols and examined it. "Now, I don't know what to do about these." "Take them home and hang them over the mantel," Rand advised. "If I'm going to have anything to do with selling the collection, I don't want anything to do with them." Goode was peering at the ivory inlay on the underbelly of the stock. "They are beautiful, and I don't care when they were made," he said. "I think, if nobody else wants them, I'll do just that. Now, Mr. Rand, what had you intended doing about the collection?" "Well, that's what I came to see you about, Mr. Goode. As I understand it, it is you who are officially responsible for selling the collection, and the proceeds would be turned over to you for distribution to Mrs. Fleming, Mrs. Dunmore, and Mrs. Varcek. Is that correct?" "Yes. The collection, although in the physical possession of Mrs. Fleming, is still an undistributed asset." "I thought so." Rand got out Gladys Fleming's letter of authorization and handed it to Goode. "As you'll see by that, I was retained by, and only by, Mrs. Fleming," he said. "I am assuming that her interests are identical with those of the other heirs, but I realize that this is true only to a very limited extent. It's my understanding that relations between the three ladies are not the most pleasant." Goode produced a short, croaking laugh. "Now there's a cautious understatement," he commented. "Mr. Rand, I feel that you should know that all three hate each other poisonously." "That was rather my impression. Now I expect some trouble from Mrs. Dunmore and/or Mrs. Varcek, either or both of whom are sure to accuse me of having been brought into this by Mrs. Fleming to help her defraud the others. That, of course, is not the case. They will all profit equally by my participation in this. But I'm going to have trouble convincing them of that." "Yes, you will," Goode agreed. "Would you rather carry my authorization than Mrs. Fleming's?" "Yes, indeed, Mr. Goode. To tell you the truth, that was why I came here, for one reason. You would not be obligated in any way by authorizing me to act as your agent. I'm getting my fee from Mrs. Fleming. But I would be obligated to represent her only as far as her interests did not improperly conflict with those of the other heirs, and that's what I want made clear." Goode favored the detective with a saurian smile. "You're not a lawyer, too, Mr. Rand?" he asked. "Well, I am a member of the bar in the state of Mississippi, though I never practiced," Rand admitted. "Instead of opening a law office, I went to the FBI in 1935, and then opened a private agency a couple of years later. But if I had to, which God forbid, I could go home tomorrow and hang out my shingle." "You seem to have had quite an eventful career," Goode remarked, with a queer combination of envy and disapproval. "I understand that until recently you were an officer in the Army Intelligence, too. I'll have your authorization to act for me made out immediately, to list and appraise the collection, and to negotiate with prospective purchasers. And by the way," he continued, "did I understand you to say that you had heard some of these silly rumors to the effect that Lane Fleming had committed suicide?" "Oh, that's what's always heard, under the circumstances," Rand shrugged. "A certain type of sensation-loving mind." "Mr. Rand, there is not one scintilla of truth in any of these scurrilous stories," Goode declared, pumping up a fine show of indignation. "The Premix Company is in the best possible financial condition. A glance at its books or at its last financial statement would show that. I ought to know, I'm chairman of the board of directors. Just because there was some talk of retrenchment shortly before Mr. Fleming's death—" "Oh, no responsible person pays any attention to that sort of talk," Rand comforted him. "My armed guard and armored car service brings me into contact with a lot of the local financial crowd. None of them is taking these rumors seriously. Well, of course, nobody wants the responsibility of starting a panic, even a minor one, but people are talking, and it's hurting Premix on the market," Goode gloomed. "And now people will hear of Mrs. Fleming's having retained you, and will assume, just as I did at first, that you are making some kind of an investigation. I hope you'll make a prompt denial if you hear any talk like that." He pressed a button on his desk. "And now I'll get a letter of authorization made out for you, Mr. Rand." End of Chapter 3.